Most people don't know this water agreement just made Canada impossible to pressure. Most people don't know this water agreement just made Canada impossible to pressure. Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that buried in the technical language of an environmental treaty signed 18 months ago lies a clause so consequential that it has fundamentally altered the balance of power in North America? And what if I told you that this single provision, overlooked by most analysts and dismissed by those who noticed it, has given Canada the ability to say no to the United States without fear of retaliation for the first time in modern history? For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has operated on a simple assumption. Canada supplied resources, America provided markets. Canada needed access to American consumers more than America needed Canadian commodities. This arrangement worked because Canada had nowhere else to go. The geography was clear. The economics were obvious. Canadian prosperity depended on American goodwill, and everyone understood that dependence created a permanent power imbalance that Washington could exploit whenever necessary. That assumption died quietly in a conference room in Ottawa during the renegotiation of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Most people never heard about it. Those who did assumed it was another bureaucratic update to environmental regulations. What actually happened was far more significant. Canada secured legal mechanisms that make it impossible for the United States to solve its emerging water crisis without Canadian permission. And Canadian permission now comes with conditions that have nothing to do with water quality and everything to do with sovereignty. Today, this analysis will examine how a resource that everyone assumed was too abundant to weaponize has become the foundation of Canadian leverage over American strategic planning. How the driest regions of the United States are about to discover they cannot function without resources they do not control. And how the country that has dominated the Western Hemisphere for generations is learning what it feels like to negotiate from need rather than strength. Before diving deeper into these implications, if this examination of resource power and structural dependency provides value, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps continue producing analysis of developments that reshape global power even when mainstream coverage ignores them. To understand why this water agreement represents such a profound shift, the context of American water scarcity must be established first. The Colorado River system, which provides water to 40 million people across 7 states, has been in decline for over 2 decades. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, dropped to levels in 2023 that exposed intake pipes designed to be permanently submerged. The mathematics are unforgiving. More water is being extracted annually than precipitation and runoff can replace. The deficit is structural, not cyclical. Conservation helps at the margins, but cannot close the gap between supply and demand. Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that buried in the technical language of an environmental treaty signed 18 months ago lies a clause so consequential that it has fundamentally altered the balance of power in North America? And what if I told you that this single provision, overlooked by most analysts and dismissed by those who noticed it, has given Canada the ability to say no to the United States without fear of retaliation for the first time in modern history? For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has operated on a simple assumption. Canada supplied resources. America provided markets. Canada needed access to American consumers more than America needed Canadian commodities. This arrangement worked because Canada had nowhere else to go. The geography was clear. The economics were obvious. Canadian prosperity depended on American goodwill, and everyone understood that dependence created a permanent power imbalance that Washington could exploit whenever necessary. That assumption died quietly in a conference room in Ottawa during the renegotiation of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Most people never heard about it. Those who did assumed it was another bureaucratic update to environmental regulations. What actually happened was far more significant. Canada secured legal mechanisms that make it impossible for the United States to solve its emerging water crisis without Canadian permission. And Canadian permission now comes with conditions that have nothing to do with water quality and everything to do with sovereignty. Today, this analysis will examine how a resource that everyone assumed was too abundant to weaponize has become the foundation of Canadian leverage over American strategic planning. How the driest regions of the United States are about to discover they cannot function without resources they do not control. And how the country that has dominated the Western Hemisphere for generations is learning what it feels like to negotiate from need rather than strength. Before diving deeper into these implications, if this examination of resource power and structural dependency provides value, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps continue producing analysis of developments that reshape global power even when mainstream coverage ignores them. To understand why this water agreement represents such a profound shift, the context of American water scarcity must be established first. The Colorado River system, which provides water to 40 million people across 7 states, has been in decline for over 2 decades. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, dropped to levels in 2023 that exposed intake pipes designed to be permanently submerged. The mathematics are unforgiving. More water is being extracted annually than precipitation and runoff can replace. The deficit is structural, not cyclical. Conservation helps at the margins, but cannot close the gap between supply and demand. California agriculture, which produces over 1/3 of American vegetables and 2/3 of American fruits and nuts, depends on water systems that are approaching collapse. The Central Valley aquifers are being depleted at rates that have caused measurable land subsidence. Some regions have dropped over 30 feet as underground water is extracted faster than natural processes can replenish it. This is not a temporary drought. This is permanent depletion of resources that took thousands of years to accumulate. Arizona and Nevada face similar mathematics. Cities built for hundreds of thousands now house millions. Economic activity expanded based on assumptions about water availability that are no longer valid. The political structures governing water allocation were designed for a different climate and a smaller population. Those structures are failing under pressures they were never designed to handle. American policymakers understand the severity. Proposals for massive desalination plants dot the planning documents of coastal states. Water recycling mandates are being implemented. Agricultural water usage is being restricted. Every possible alternative is being explored to address the deficit domestically. The problem is that none of these alternatives can scale quickly enough or cheaply enough to prevent serious disruption to economic activity in the American Southwest. This creates a simple but profound strategic vulnerability. The United States needs water it does not have. The only nearby source capable of supplying the volumes required is Canada. And Canada just ensured they control whether that water ever crosses the border. The Great Lakes. Water Quality Agreement was first signed in 1972 and has been updated periodically to address pollution, invasive species, and ecosystem protection. The 2024 renegotiation appeared to follow this pattern. Environmental groups praised it, indigenous communities supported it. Both governments presented it as bipartisan cooperation on shared environmental stewardship. The coverage was minimal because water quality agreements do not generate headlines. But buried in the technical annexes was a provision that fundamentally altered water diversion rights. Any proposal to transfer Great Lakes water outside the basin for any purpose now requires unanimous consent from all Great Lakes states and provinces. This provision appears reasonable on its surface. It protects the Great Lakes ecosystem from extraction that could damage water levels or ecological balance. It ensures that communities surrounding the lakes have a voice in decisions affecting their water security. The strategic implication is what matters. Ontario and Quebec now hold absolute veto power over any American attempt to address southwestern water scarcity using Great Lakes resources. Every proposal to build pipelines, every plan to establish water transfers, every engineering solution that involves moving Great Lakes water to water-stressed regions must receive Canadian provincial approval. And that approval is discretionary, not automatic. Canadian officials were explicit about their reasoning during the negotiations, though few people paid attention to the language. The agreement protects Canadian water sovereignty. It ensures that Canadian resources serve Canadian interests first. It establishes that water flowing through Canadian territory is subject to Canadian law and Canadian priorities regardless of American needs or American preferences. This was not hostile. This was not confrontational. This was simply Canada establishing legal control over resources within their borders. But the effect is revolutionary. For the first time, the United States faces a critical resource dependency on Canada that Canada can leverage without fear of overwhelming retaliation. The reason this creates genuine leverage is simple. Water is not optional. Agriculture cannot function without it. Industry cannot operate without it. Cities cannot exist without it. And the American Southwest is running out. Desalination helps coastal communities, but cannot supply interior agricultural regions at costs that make farming economically viable. Groundwater depletion is accelerating despite restrictions. Conservation reduces consumption, but cannot eliminate the structural deficit. This means the United States will face a choice within the next decade. Accept reduced economic activity in water-stressed regions, or negotiate access to external water sources. The only external source that is geographically proximate, politically stable, and physically capable of supplying the volumes needed is Canada. And Canada has spent the last 18 months ensuring that access requires Canadian approval on Canadian terms. The framework Canada established goes beyond the Great Lakes Agreement. Parallel negotiations with European partners created technical cooperation agreements on water management technology. Memoranda of understanding with several Asian countries explored potential future bulk water exports if regional scarcity intensifies. These agreements do not involve large water shipments currently. That is not their purpose. Their purpose is to establish that Canadian water resources have international value and alternative customers. This creates options. When you have one customer for a critical resource, you are a supplicant. When you have multiple potential customers competing for access, you are a power broker. Canada is systematically, patiently moving from the first position to the second. And they are doing it with a resource the United States cannot easily replace through domestic production or alternative suppliers. The sophistication of this approach deserves emphasis. Canada is not threatening to cut off water. Canada is not demanding immediate concessions. Canada is not engaging in confrontational resource nationalism. Canada is simply establishing legal frameworks and international partnerships that give them control over allocation decisions. And then waiting for American water needs to become urgent enough that American negotiators have to accept Canadian terms. This is how resource leverage operates in the modern era. Direct threats create backlash and accelerate efforts to find alternatives. But patient establishment of control over essential inputs creates dependencies that are difficult to escape once recognized. By the time the dependency becomes politically visible, the alternatives have been exhausted, and the structural reality cannot be avoided. American officials are beginning to recognize this dynamic. State-level water agencies in the Southwest have conducted preliminary assessments of potential Canadian water imports. The technical challenges are manageable. The infrastructure could be built, but every proposal encounters the same barrier. Canadian regulatory approval is required at multiple levels, and preliminary discussions reveal that approval will come with conditions extending far beyond water itself. If American states want Canadian water, they will need to accept Canadian terms on trade policy, energy cooperation, environmental standards, and recognition of Canadian resource sovereignty. Water access will be bundled with other Canadian priorities in ways that give Canada negotiating leverage across multiple domains. This is the definition of structural power. Canada does not need to threaten or coerce. Canada simply needs to control something essential that America needs. The dependency itself creates the leverage. And that leverage exists now before any water actually crosses the border, because the possibility of future water access creates immediate negotiating pressure. The timeline intensifies the dynamic. Federal water agencies project that current supply systems in the American Southwest will be insufficient to meet demand within 10 to 15 years, even with aggressive conservation and alternative development. The gap between supply and demand is widening, not closing. The physics and geography are unforgiving. This means negotiations over Canadian water access will become urgent within the current decade. And those negotiations will occur in a context where Canada has established legal control, developed alternative partnerships, and created frameworks that make Canadian approval necessary for American solutions. Canada will be negotiating from strength, not desperation. Historical patterns are instructive here. Every major shift in international power has ultimately rested on control of essential resources. Britain controlled global shipping networks in the 19th century and used that control to enforce favorable trade terms. The United States controlled oil distribution in the 20th century and used that control to shape Middle Eastern politics. China controls rare earth processing today and uses that control to influence technology supply chains. Canada is now positioned to control North American water security. The mechanisms are in place. The alternatives are insufficient. The timeline is shortening. And Canadian officials understand that this represents the most significant leverage Canada has ever held over American strategic planning. The American response reveals the psychological difficulty powerful nations face when confronting new dependencies. Publicly, there is minimal discussion. Water scarcity is treated as a regional policy challenge, not a strategic vulnerability. The possibility that the United States might need to negotiate with Canada for water access on terms Canada dictates is not part of mainstream political discourse. But at other levels, awareness is growing. Defense policy documents now include water security as a strategic concern. Trade negotiators recognize that Canada's resource position has fundamentally changed. State governments are exploring every possible alternative to Canadian dependence and discovering the alternatives are inadequate. This gap between recognition and acceptance is where leverage operates. The United States recognizes water scarcity as a problem. American officials have not yet accepted that solving it requires accepting Canadian terms. The interval between recognition and acceptance is when dependencies become politically exploitable. Canada is operating in that interval with precision. No demands for immediate concessions, no threats to withhold resources, and just patient establishment of frameworks that make Canadian approval necessary when American needs become undeniable. This is resource strategy at its most sophisticated. The broader implications extend beyond water itself. Every major negotiation between the United States and Canada now occurs against the backdrop of American water vulnerability. Trade disputes, defense cooperation, climate policy, border management. All these discussions are influenced by the knowledge that America needs Canadian water, and Canada has options about whether to provide it. This does not mean Canada dictates American policy. It means Canada no longer accepts American dictation of Canadian policy. It means negotiations occur between powers with mutual dependencies, rather than between a hegemon and a subordinate. That shift is permanent because the geography cannot be changed. Canada controls 20% of global freshwater. The American Southwest faces structural water deficits. The negotiating reality endures. Provincial actions reinforce this shift. Quebec introduced regulations on water extraction requiring environmental assessments that effectively created barriers to large-scale exports to the United States while leaving discretion for other arrangements. Ontario implemented similar measures, framed as Indigenous rights protection and Great Lakes ecology. The effect is identical. American access to Canadian water faces regulatory hurdles that did not exist previously, while Canadian governments retain authority to approve projects serving Canadian interests. This is resource leverage in practice. No dramatic announcements, no confrontational denials, just establishment of legal frameworks giving Canada control over allocation decisions, frameworks that require Canadian approval for projects others need, and then using that approval process to ensure broader Canadian interests receive respect in other negotiations. International partnerships accelerated this strategy. Trade agreements with the European Union integrated Canadian companies into European supply chains. Bilateral arrangements with Asian countries positioned Canada as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all partners. Even relations with China were recalibrated to ensure Canadian companies could access both American and Chinese markets, while competitors faced binary choices. The result is visible in trade flows. By late 2025, Canadian exports to Europe increased 34% year over year. Exports to Asia rose 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports declined as international buyers found alternative suppliers not subject to political uncertainty. Foreign investment in Canadian infrastructure jumped over 300% in one quarter. Global capital was voting with money, betting that Canada represented stability and growth. These developments converge on a single conclusion. The water agreement that most people never noticed has accomplished what decades of Canadian policy could not achieve through other means. It made Canadian sovereignty real rather than rhetorical. It made Canadian interests matter in North American decisions because Canadian cooperation became essential rather than assumed. And it happened quietly, through documents and frameworks, through patient accumulation of legal structures and international partnerships creating new realities without announcing them. No grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations, just methodical construction of alternatives and controls that shift structural power. The United States will adapt eventually because nations always adapt to new realities. But adaptation takes time. The period between old realities ending and new realities being accepted is when mistakes happen. When powerful nations make demands they can no longer enforce. When resource controllers test limits they have not fully mapped. When miscalculation becomes likely. The water agreement is stable. The framework is established. But the full implications have not been tested under genuine stress. What happens when American water needs become desperate? What happens when Canadian officials prioritize different customers? What happens when asymmetry of need becomes politically visible to populations on both sides of the border? These questions will be answered in the next decade. The answers will determine whether North American integration continues on revised terms or fractures into something more transactional. The outcome depends less on resources themselves than on whether American leadership can accept negotiating from need rather than strength. History suggests powerful nations struggle with that psychological adjustment. Rome never accepted they needed Germanic cooperation until Germanic armies made acceptance irrelevant. Britain never accepted they needed American partnership until American economic power made British preferences secondary. The pattern is consistent. The powerful resist. Recognizing changed circumstances until change becomes crisis. Whether the United States repeats this pattern remains unknown. What is known is that structural conditions parallel previous transitions. Canadian resource leverage is real and growing. American water needs are intensifying. The timeline for crisis is shorter than political systems typically operate on. And the frameworks giving Canada control are already in place. This is not future possibility. This is present reality not yet fully recognized. The water agreements are signed. The regulatory structures exist. The international partnerships are established. Canada made itself impossible to pressure through patient construction of alternatives and controls. That construction is complete. What remains is for the United States to discover this reality through experience rather than analysis. That discovery, when it comes under conditions of genuine need, will be when the balance of power in North America becomes undeniable to everyone watching. By the time this is understood clearly enough to become mainstream discourse, it will no longer matter. The frameworks will be established. The alternatives will exist. The dependencies will be structural. And Canada will operate as a resource power with options, not a junior partner with obligations. This is what irreversible looks like before people recognize it as irreversible. This is how power moves between nation